My wife worked night shifts 3 times a week. For 7 years, I never questioned the hospital story. Julia would kiss me goodbye at 10:30, her scrubs crisp and professional, her smile tired but loving. "Another long one tonight, honey," she'd say, and I'd watch her taillights disappear down Maple Street. I'm Tom Bradley, 38 years old, construction foreman with calloused hands and a suspicious mind that finally woke up. The awakening came courtesy of our bank statement, which showed withdrawals that never matched our household spending. Coffee shop purchases at noon when she claimed to be sleeping, gas station receipts from across town, restaurant charges for meals she never brought home. The pieces didn't fit, and I've been putting pieces together my whole life. First with Lego blocks, then with 2x4s, and now with the fragments of my marriage. Tuesday night, October 15th, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of falling asleep to late-night television, I followed those familiar taillights. My truck stayed 3 cars back as Julia drove past the medical district, past the hospital where she supposedly worked, into the quiet suburbs of Willowbrook. She pulled into the driveway of a colonial house with white shutters and a wraparound porch. The kind of house we dreamed about but never could afford on my construction wages and her nursing salary. Except apparently we could afford it. She could afford it. I parked across the street, engine off, watching through my cracked windshield as Julia walked to the front door. She didn't knock. She had keys. The door opened before she could use them, and a man appeared. Tall, clean-shaven, wearing khakis and a polo shirt like he'd stepped out of a catalog. He kissed her. Not a friendly peck, but the kind of kiss I used to get when I came home from work. The kind that said, "Welcome home, honey." The kind that meant everything. Then the children appeared. A boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 8 years old, rushing past the man to wrap their arms around Julia's legs. Their voices carried across the quiet street. "Mommy, Mommy's home." I sat in my truck for 2 hours, taking 62 photographs with my phone, Julia helping with homework at the kitchen table, Julia reading bedtime stories, Julia kissing the children goodnight, Julia sitting on the couch with the man, his arm around her shoulders, watching television like any normal couple on any normal Tuesday night. Except this wasn't normal. This was my wife living a completely different life with a completely different family while I sat home eating microwave dinners and wondering why she seemed so distant lately. The man's name was Lawson Pierce, according to the mailbox. Real estate agent, based on the magnetic sign on his BMW. Successful enough to afford the house, the car, and apparently my wife's affection 3 nights a week. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Julia's car wasn't in our driveway yet. Her shift wouldn't end until 7 in the morning. I had time to think, to plan, to decide what came next. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night in my workshop, staring at the photographs on my phone, trying to understand how 7 years of marriage could evaporate into this elaborate lie. How many times had she looked me in the eye and lied? How many "I love yous" were just lines in a script she'd memorized? The worst part wasn't the betrayal. The worst part was how good she was at it. How natural she looked in that other house with those other children, living that other life. Like it was more real than what we had. At 6:30, I heard her car in the driveway. I heard her key in the lock, her tired sigh as she kicked off her shoes. I heard her shower running, washing away the evidence of where she'd really been. When she came downstairs at 8, I was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and a manila envelope. "Morning, honey," she said, kissing my forehead. "How'd you sleep?" "Like a rock," I lied, sliding the envelope across the table. "These came for you." She sat down, reached for her coffee, and opened the envelope. The photographs spilled out like evidence at a crime scene. Julia at the front door, Julia with the children, Julia kissing Lawson Pierce. She choked on her coffee. Actually choked. The liquid catching in her throat as her eyes went wide. The cup slipped from her fingers, ceramic shattering against the hardwood floor. "Tom, I can explain." "No need," I said, pulling out the second envelope. "Divorce papers. I had them drawn up last night. Amazing what you can accomplish when you can't sleep." Her face went pale, then red, then pale again. "You followed me." "I followed my wife. Turns out I don't know who that is anymore." She tried tears first, real ones streaming down her cheeks as she begged for forgiveness, for understanding, for another chance. When that didn't work, she tried anger. How dare I spy on her? How dare I assume the worst? How dare I throw away our marriage over a misunderstanding? "Misunderstanding?" I laughed, the sound bitter in my own ears. "Julia, you have another family. Children who call you mommy. A husband who thinks he's married to you. What exactly am I misunderstanding?" That's when she tried the truth, or her version of it. "It started as a mistake," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was covering for another nurse, working a different shift, and I met Lawson at the coffee shop near the hospital. We talked. He was going through a divorce, lonely, and I was married, I finished. You were married, to me, she flinched. You were working so much, Tom. 60-hour weeks, coming home exhausted, falling asleep on the couch. We barely talked anymore. So you found someone who had more time for conversation. It wasn't supposed to happen. The feelings, I mean. But Lawson made me feel alive again, important, like I mattered. I stared at her, this woman I'd shared a bed with for 7 years, and realized I was looking at a stranger. What about the children? Her composure cracked completely. They're his from his first marriage. His ex-wife, she had problems, addiction. She signed away her parental rights 2 years ago. The kids needed a mother figure, and I... You what? Decided to play house while I sat here like an idiot? I never meant for it to go this far. But they needed me, Tom. Really needed me. And Lawson, he talked about making it official, about us being a real family. You are part of a real family, this family, our family. She shook her head. What family? We don't have children. We barely have a marriage. When's the last time we went out together? When's the last time we made plans for the future? The accusation stung because they held a grain of truth. We had grown distant. Work had consumed me, and I'd assumed Julia understood. Construction jobs don't wait for convenient schedules, and foreman positions don't grow on trees. I'd been building our future, or so I thought. So you built a different future, I said, with someone else. I was going to tell you, eventually. I just needed time to figure out how. How long, Julia? How long were you planning to live this double life? She couldn't meet my eyes. Lawson's been talking about marriage. Real marriage. He wants to adopt the children officially, give them stability. And what about me? What about our marriage? I thought, maybe we could work something out. Maybe we could separate quietly, amicably. You could find someone better suited for you, someone who wants the same things you want. I laughed again, the sound harsh in the quiet kitchen. How considerate of you. Planning my future while you lived yours? The divorce papers lay between us like a roadblock. Julia picked them up, her hands trembling as she read the terms. I'd been generous. She could keep her car, her personal belongings, half of our modest savings account. The house would be sold, proceeds split equally. You can't be serious about this, she said. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Tom, please, we can work this out. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I'll end things with Lawson. I'll quit the hospital, find work somewhere else, start fresh. You think this is about Lawson? I stood up, pacing to the window where I could see Mrs. Dower watering her petunias next door. This isn't about him. This is about you. About 7 years of lies. About coming home to me every night after tucking someone else's children into bed. They're not just someone else's children anymore. I love them. More than you love me. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, she whispered, It's different. They need me in a way you never have. And there it was. The truth beneath all the excuses and explanations. I'd been too independent, too self-sufficient. I'd never needed her the way those children did, never made her feel indispensable. In trying to be a strong husband, I'd made myself unnecessary. But understanding her motivation didn't excuse her choices, didn't justify 7 years of deception. Sign the papers, Julia. I need time to think. You've had 7 years to think. Sign them. She picked up the pen with shaking fingers, paused over the signature line, then set it down again. What if I choose you? What if I end things with Lawson and choose our marriage? I looked at her, really looked at her, and tried to imagine going back. Tried to picture myself trusting her again, believing her when she said she was working late or running errands. Tried to envision a future where I didn't wonder every time she left the house. I don't think you can, I said finally. And I don't think I want you to. She signed the papers with tears streaming down her face, her signature a shaky scrawl across the bottom of the page. When she finished, she looked up at me with something that might have been hope. What happens now? Now you pack your things. You have until tonight to get what you need. I'll have the rest shipped wherever you want. Tom, we're done talking, Julia. We're done with everything. She left that afternoon with 2 suitcases and 7 years' worth of guilt. I watched from the window as she loaded her car, pausing to look back at the house once before driving away. Mrs. Dower watched too, her watering can forgotten in her hands. An hour later, she knocked on my door. Terrible shame, she said without preamble, though I can't say I'm surprised. You knew? Honey, I've lived next door to you for 15 years. I know when someone's car is in the driveway and when it's not. Julia's been parking around the corner on Elm Street for months, walking home in the morning like she's fooling someone. I invited her in for coffee, and she told me what she'd observed. The late-night phone calls Julia took in the backyard, the packages delivered during the day when I was at work, the way Julia had started dressing differently, wearing perfume to her night shifts. "Why didn't you say something?" Mrs. Dower stirred sugar into her coffee thoughtfully. "Not my place to get involved in other people's marriages, but if you're asking, I think you're better off without her. A woman who can lie that easily about one thing can lie about anything." That evening, I called my friend Eddie from work. Eddie Martinez had been on my crew for 5 years, a reliable guy with a wife and 3 kids of his own. If anyone would understand what I was going through, it would be him. "Jesus, Tom," he said when I told him the story. 7 years? How do you live a double life for 7 years? Practice, apparently. What are you going to do? I'd been thinking about that all day. The divorce would take months to finalize. Julia would probably move in with Lawson and his children, playing the role she'd been rehearsing for years. They'd get married eventually, become the perfect suburban family she'd always wanted. Meanwhile, I'd sell the house, split the proceeds, and start over at 38. It wasn't the future I'd planned, but it was better than living a lie. "I'm going to let her go," I said. "Let her have her perfect life with her perfect family." "That's it? You're just going to walk away?" "What else can I do?" Eddie was quiet for a moment. "You could make sure everyone knows what kind of person she really is." The suggestion hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted exactly that. Wanted the world to know that Julia Bradley was a liar and a cheat. Wanted Lawson Pierce to understand what kind of woman he was planning to marry. Wanted those children to know their mommy had another family she'd abandoned. But a bigger part of me just wanted it to be over. "I'm not that guy, Eddie. Maybe you should be." But I was that guy. I just didn't know it yet. The realization came 3 days later when I ran into Dr. Martinez at the grocery store. Not Eddie Martinez from my crew, but Dr. Patricia Martinez from the hospital where Julia supposedly worked. We'd met at a few hospital charity events over the years, back when Julia still bothered to invite me to her work functions. "Tom," she said, her face lighting up with recognition, "how's Julia doing? We miss her on the day shift." "Day shift, not night shift. Day shift." "She's fine," I managed. "Just busy with other things." "I heard she transferred to St. Mary's across town. Good for her, getting a fresh start. Though I have to say we were surprised when she put in for the transfer. She'd been asking about night shifts for years, said she preferred the schedule." My hands tightened on the shopping cart handle. "When did she transfer?" "Oh, about 3 years ago now. Time flies, doesn't it?" 3 years. Julia had been lying about working at the hospital for 3 years, which meant her relationship with Lawson Pierce was older than she'd admitted. Much older. I finished my shopping in a daze, my mind racing through the implications. If Julia had been lying about work for 3 years, what else had she been lying about? How long had she really been with Lawson? How long had she been planning to leave me? That night, I called Eddie back. "I changed my mind," I said, "about letting her go quietly." "What happened?" I told him about Dr. Martinez, about the 3-year lie, about the growing certainty that Julia's betrayal was deeper and more calculated than I'd realized. "So, what do you want to do?" "I want her to face consequences. Real consequences. I want Lawson to know exactly what kind of woman he's getting involved with. And I want those kids to understand that their mommy is someone who abandons families when it's convenient." "How?" I'd been thinking about that. Julia's whole life was built on maintaining separate identities, keeping her 2 worlds from colliding. What would happen if those worlds suddenly crashed together? "I'm going to introduce her 2 families to each other." Eddie was quiet for a moment. "That's actually brilliant. How?" "I'm still working on the details, but I know where Lawson lives, where he works, where his kids go to school. I know Julia's schedule, her routines, her weaknesses. I know things about her that he doesn't, and I know things about him that she probably doesn't." "Such as?" I'd spent the last 3 days researching Lawson Pierce online. Social media, professional websites, public records. The man had left quite a digital footprint. Such as the fact that he's not divorced. He's separated, but the divorce was never finalized, which means his marriage to Julia would be invalid. Such as the fact that his ex-wife has been trying to get visitation rights with the children, and he's been blocking her in court. Such as the fact that he owes back taxes on 3 different properties. "You've been busy." "I'm a thorough guy, and I'm just getting started." The plan began to take shape over the next week. It was elegant in its simplicity. I would force Julia and Lawson to confront the reality of their situation by making their deception public. Not through violence or threats, but through exposure. Truth had a way of destroying lies, and their entire relationship was built on lies. Step 1 was gathering evidence. I already had the photographs from that first night, but I needed more. I needed documentation of the financial deception, the work lies, the elaborate scheduling that made Julia's double life possible. I started with our joint bank account. 7 years of statements revealed a pattern I'd been too trusting to notice. Regular transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Cash withdrawals that coincided with her night shifts. Credit card charges for children's clothing, toys, school supplies, things we'd never purchased together. Julia had been supporting Lawson's household with our money. My money. The overtime I'd worked to build our future had been funding her alternate life. Step 2 was surveillance. I took vacation time from work and spent a week learning Julia's real schedule. She left our house at 10:30 on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights. But she didn't go straight to Lawson's house. First, she stopped at a 24-hour gym to shower and change clothes. Then she drove to a different parking lot to switch cars. Apparently, Lawson had bought her a second vehicle, a silver sedan that stayed parked behind a strip mall. The level of planning was staggering. Julia had created an entire infrastructure to support her deception. Phone records showed she had a second cell phone. Mail forwarding showed she had packages delivered to a post office box. She'd built a parallel life so complete that she could disappear into it 3 nights a week without leaving a trace. Except she had left traces. She'd left 7 years' worth of traces, and now I was collecting them all. Step 3 was the hardest part. Patience. I wanted to confront Lawson immediately, to show up at his door with evidence of Julia's deception and watch his perfect world crumble. But that would only hurt him, and he wasn't really the enemy here. He was another victim of Julia's lies, just like me. Instead, I decided to let them destroy themselves. I started small. Anonymous tips to Lawson's ex-wife about his new girlfriend and her role in the children's lives. Anonymous reports to the school district about unauthorized adults picking up the children. Anonymous complaints to his real estate office about his personal life affecting his professional reputation. Each tip was carefully crafted to sound like it came from a concerned neighbor or colleague. Each report included just enough detail to be credible without revealing my involvement. I was a ghost haunting their perfect suburban life, introducing chaos one small revelation at a time. The effects were immediate. Lawson's ex-wife filed for emergency visitation hearings. The school district required background checks for anyone authorized to pick up the children. His real estate office received complaints about his unprofessional conduct with clients. Julia began to crack under the pressure. I could see it in the way she carried herself, the dark circles under her eyes, the nervous energy that followed her around the house. She started making mistakes, forgetting to delete text messages, leaving receipts in her pockets, taking phone calls she thought I couldn't hear. "Everything okay at work?" I asked one morning, watching her pace the kitchen while coffee brewed. "Fine," she said, but her voice was tight. "Just some administrative issues. Personnel stuff." I nodded sympathetically, hiding my satisfaction. The personnel stuff was actually a formal complaint I'd filed with St. Mary's Hospital about an employee using false credentials. It wasn't true, of course, but it was plausible enough to trigger an investigation. "Anything I can help with?" "No, it's complicated. Work politics, you know?" I knew exactly what it was. It was the beginning of the end of her carefully constructed double life, and I was just getting started. That afternoon, while Julia was at her real job, I drove to Lawson's neighborhood, not to confront him, but to deliver a package. Inside was a manila envelope containing copies of Julia's real employment records, bank statements showing the financial transfers, and a note that simply read, "Ask her about her husband." I left it in his mailbox and drove away, imagining the conversation that would follow when he got home from work. Would Julia try to explain? Would she finally tell him the truth about our marriage? Or would she spin another elaborate lie to keep her two worlds separate? It didn't matter. The truth was like water finding its way through a crack in a dam. Once it started flowing, it was impossible to stop. That night, Julia came home early from her shift. She was agitated, distracted, jumping at every sound. When I asked about her evening, she gave me a story about a patient emergency that required all hands on deck. "Must have been serious," I said. "Very serious. Touch and go for a while." I nodded, wondering if she knew how easily her lies fell apart under scrutiny. There had been no patient emergency at St. Mary's that night. I'd called to check, claiming to be a concerned family member. Julia had spent the evening at Lawson's house, probably trying to explain away the contents of my envelope. The next morning, I found her crying in the shower. Real tears, not the calculated ones she'd used during our divorce conversation. These were tears of desperation, of a woman watching her carefully constructed world collapse around her. "Bad night?" I asked when she came downstairs. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Want to talk about it?" "I can't. It's confidential. Patient privacy laws." Even now, even when her lies were crumbling, she couldn't tell me the truth. It was almost impressive in its consistency. "Well, if you need anything." "Actually," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I might need to take some time off. Personal leave, maybe stay with my sister for a while." Her sister lived in California, 3,000 miles away from both her families, from both her lives. It was the geographic equivalent of surrender. "Of course," I said. "Whatever you need." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret, or maybe it was just fear of getting caught. "Tom, It's okay, Julia. You don't have to explain anything." But she did have to explain. To Lawson, to his children, to his ex-wife, to her co-workers, to everyone who'd been touched by her deception. She had to explain 7 years of lies, and I was going to make sure she didn't have a choice in the matter. The end game was approaching, and Julia could feel it. She just didn't know I was the one orchestrating it. The beauty of my plan was that Julia was destroying herself. All I had to do was provide the right pressure at the right moments, like a controlled demolition where each charge detonates in sequence to bring down the whole structure. The next charge came in the form of Mrs. Henderson, Lawson's ex-wife. My anonymous tips had motivated her to hire a private investigator, and that investigator had been busy. He'd photographed Julia picking up the children from school, documented her overnight stays at Lawson's house, and traced her real identity back to me. Mrs. Henderson called me on a Thursday morning. "Mr. Bradley, this is Margaret Henderson. I believe you know my husband's girlfriend." I feigned confusion. "I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong number." "Julia Bradley. She's been living with my husband and my children for the past several years. According to my investigator, she's also married to you." "Ah." I let the silence stretch, as if I was processing this information for the first time. "I see. Mr. Bradley, I think we need to talk." We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of us would be recognized. Margaret Henderson was a thin woman in her early 40s, with a hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been fighting battles for too long. She spread photographs across the table between us. Julia at the school, Julia at the grocery store with the children, Julia kissing Lawson goodbye on his front porch. "How long have you known?" she asked. "About a week," I lied. "I hired my own investigator when I started suspecting something." "And before that?" "Before that, I thought my wife worked night shifts at the hospital 3 times a week. Apparently, I was wrong about a lot of things." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Join the club? I thought my husband was a devoted father who'd moved on from our marriage. Turns out he just replaced me with a newer model." We compared stories, filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge. Margaret confirmed that Lawson had never finalized their divorce. He'd been stalling the proceedings for 2 years, claiming he needed more time to sort out custody arrangements. Meanwhile, he'd been playing house with Julia, letting her believe they had a future together. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want my children back, and I want them away from that woman. Julia's not the problem here. She's a victim too, in her way. The problem is that everyone's been lying to everyone else for years." "So what do you suggest?" I suggested the truth. All of it, delivered simultaneously to everyone involved. No more secrets, no more separate lives, no more elaborate deceptions. Just the messy, complicated reality of what Julia and Lawson had created. Margaret was skeptical. That could backfire. If everyone knows everything, the children get hurt. The scandal could affect custody proceedings. The children are already being hurt. They're living with a woman who's been lying to them about who she is. They're calling someone mommy who has another family across town. They deserve better than that. And what about you? What do you get out of exposing all this? I thought about that. What did I want? Revenge? Justice? The satisfaction of watching Julia's perfect alternate life crumble? I want her to face consequences for her choices. Real consequences, not just the inconvenience of a divorce. I want her to understand that actions have repercussions beyond her immediate comfort. Margaret nodded slowly. "When?" "This weekend, Saturday night. Julia will be at Lawson's house for her usual shift. That's when we'll introduce everyone to everyone else." We spent the next hour planning the details. Margaret would arrive at Lawson's house at 9 o'clock with a court-appointed mediator and demand to see her children. I would arrive 30 minutes later with divorce papers and evidence of Julia's financial deception. Lawson's neighbors would witness the confrontation, ensuring that the whole neighborhood knew about his complicated domestic situation. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. By Sunday morning, everyone in Julia's two worlds would know about each other. Margaret left the coffee shop first, her shoulders straighter than when she'd arrived. She had a purpose now, a plan to reclaim her children and her life. I finished my coffee slowly, thinking through the implications of what we'd set in motion. Julia would be devastated. Her perfect suburban family would evaporate overnight, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of 2 relationships and the reputation of a woman who couldn't be trusted. Lawson would face custody battles, social embarrassment, and the realization that his girlfriend had been using him as an escape from her real life. The children would be confused, hurt, and probably angry. They'd lose the woman they'd been calling mommy, and they'd learn that adults could lie about fundamental things like identity and commitment. It was harsh. It was public. It was exactly what Julia deserved. Friday night, Julia came home agitated again. She'd been receiving phone calls at work, anonymous tips to her supervisor about her unprofessional conduct, and conflicts of interest. Nothing actionable, but enough to create an atmosphere of suspicion and scrutiny. Maybe that personal leave is a good idea, I suggested over dinner. Get away from all the work stress, clear your head. I can't leave right now. There are complications, things I need to resolve. What kind of complications? She looked at me across the table, and I could see her calculating how much truth she could afford to tell. Legal issues, nothing serious, just paperwork that needs to be sorted out. Legal issues. Probably Lawson's divorce proceedings, which had suddenly become urgent now that his wife knew about Julia. Or maybe custody complications now that Margaret was fighting for visitation rights. Julia's presence in the children's lives was no longer a secret, which meant it was no longer an advantage. Anything I can help with? No, it's not your problem. But it was about to become everyone's problem. Saturday evening, Julia went through her usual routine: shower, change of clothes, kiss goodbye, promises to be careful on the dangerous night shift. I watched her taillights disappear down Maple Street for what I knew would be the last time. At 8:30, I drove to Lawson's neighborhood and parked 3 blocks away. Margaret was already in position, her car idling at the corner with the court mediator beside her. We'd synchronized our watches like we were planning a military operation. At exactly 9 o'clock, Margaret knocked on Lawson's front door. I could see the porch from my position across the street, could see Lawson's confusion as he opened the door to find his estranged wife and a stranger in a business suit. The conversation was brief and heated. Margaret pushed past Lawson into the house, the mediator following with a briefcase full of legal documents. Through the windows, I could see figures moving in the living room, Lawson gesturing angrily, Margaret pointing toward the stairs where the children presumably were, Julia appearing from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands. At 9:30, I walked up to the front door and knocked. Lawson answered, his face flushed with anger and confusion. "What do you want?" "I'm Tom Bradley," I said, holding up the manila envelope. "Julia's husband. I believe we need to talk." The color drained from his face. Behind him, I could hear Margaret's voice. "This is the woman who's been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, raising my children while I've been fighting for visitation rights." And Julia's voice, higher pitched with panic. "I can explain. This isn't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. It was the collision of 2 worlds, the explosion of 7 years' worth of carefully maintained lies, the moment when all of Julia's elaborate deceptions finally caught up with her. I stepped into the house, uninvited but not unwelcome. The living room was a tableau of domestic chaos, Margaret clutching legal documents, the mediator taking notes, Lawson staring at me like I was a ghost, and Julia frozen in the doorway to the kitchen. "Hello, honey," I said to Julia. "How was your shift?" The silence in Lawson's living room was deafening. Julia stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, the dish towel still clutched in her hands, her face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and calculation. Lawson looked between Julia and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Margaret held her legal documents like a shield, and the court mediator scribbled notes with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen it all before. "Tom," Julia finally whispered, "what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, but I already know the answer." I opened my envelope and spread its contents across Lawson's coffee table. Bank statements, employment records, photographs, phone bills, 7 years of evidence laid out like a prosecutor's case. Lawson stared at the documents, his face growing paler with each revelation. "You're married," he said to Julia. It wasn't a question. "Separated," Julia said quickly. "We're getting divorced. I told you that." "You told me you were divorced. Past tense? Finished." His voice was rising, and I could hear footsteps upstairs, the children awakened by the commotion. Margaret stepped forward. "And you told my children that you were their new mother. while their real mother has been fighting in court for the right to see them. The children needed stability, Julia protested. You were in rehab, Margaret. You weren't available. I've been clean for 18 months, and I've been requesting visitation for 6 months. Lawson's been blocking every attempt. All eyes turned to Lawson, who was still staring at the bank statements. You've been stealing money, he said to Julia, from your real husband, to pay for things here. I wasn't stealing. It was our joint account. I had every right. You had the right to use marital assets to support your boyfriend? I interrupted. Interesting interpretation of marriage law. The mediator cleared his throat. Perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this calmly. There's nothing to discuss, Julia said, her voice gaining strength. This is harassment. Tom, you can't just show up here and what? Tell the truth? Introduce your two families to each other? Seems like something that should have happened years ago. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted us. 2 children appeared. The boy and girl I'd photographed that first night, both in pajamas, both rubbing sleepy eyes. Mommy Julia, the girl said, why is everyone yelling? The room fell silent again. These were the real victims of Julia's deception. 2 children who'd been calling her mommy while she had a husband across town, who'd been building a relationship with someone who was living a lie. Margaret knelt down to their level. Hi, sweethearts. I'm your real mommy. Remember me? The children looked confused, frightened by the tension in the room and the presence of strangers. The boy moved closer to Julia, seeking comfort from the only mother figure he'd known consistently. It's okay, Julia said, putting her arms around both children. Everything's going to be okay. But everything wasn't going to be okay. Everything was falling apart, and Julia was finally being forced to confront the consequences of her choices. Lawson found his voice. How long? He asked Julia. How long have you been lying to me? I never lied to you. You told me you were divorced. I said I was getting divorced. The papers were filed. 7 years ago, I added helpfully. She filed for separation 7 years ago, then withdrew the petition when she realized she could have both families. That's not true, Julia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and showed Lawson the photographs from that first night. This is your house, 7 years ago. Julia's car in the driveway, Julia putting your children to bed, Julia kissing you goodnight. The metadata shows the date. Lawson scrolled through the images, his expression growing darker. You've been watching us. I've been watching my wife. I had no idea you existed until recently. And I had no idea you existed at all, Margaret added. Imagine my surprise when my private investigator told me my husband's live-in girlfriend was married to someone else. The mediator was writing furiously, documenting every revelation. This conversation would become part of the court record, evidence in custody proceedings that would determine the children's future. Julia seemed to realize this. Please, she said, looking around the room desperately. Think about the children. They don't need to hear this. You should have thought about the children 7 years ago, I said, before you decided to play house with someone else's family while you were married to me. I love these children, Julia said, her voice breaking. I've been their mother in every way that matters. Except for the small detail that you already had a family, Margaret said coldly. Except for the fact that you were lying to them about who you were. I never lied to them. You let them call you mommy while you were married to another man. You let them believe you were going to be their permanent family while you were living a double life. If that's not lying, what is? Julia had no answer for that. She looked around the room, at Lawson's angry face, at Margaret's determined expression, at the mediator's neutral professionalism, at me with my envelope full of evidence. She was cornered, and she knew it. What do you want? She asked finally. I want you to tell the truth, I said. All of it. To everyone. No more lies, no more deception, no more separate lives. And I want my children back, Margaret added, away from someone who's been deceiving them about her identity. And I want to know who I've really been living with for the past 7 years, Lawson said, his voice hollow. Julia looked at the children, still clinging to her, still confused by the adult drama swirling around them. Can we at least take this conversation somewhere private? No, I said. No more private conversations, no more secrets. Everything gets discussed in front of everyone from now on. The mediator intervened. Mr. Bradley, while I understand your frustration, perhaps it would be better for the children if the adults could speak privately. I considered this. The children were innocent victims in Julia's elaborate deception, and they didn't deserve to be traumatized further. But I also knew that if we moved to another room, Julia would find a way to spin the situation, to minimize her deception, and shift blame to others. Fine, I said, but everything gets documented. Everything gets included in the official record. Margaret nodded. Agreed. We moved to Lawson's home office while the children stayed in the living room with a cartoon on television. The space felt cramped with 5 adults, the walls closing in as 7 years of lies finally came to light. Start talking, I said to Julia. And finally she did. Julia's confession took 2 hours. 2 hours of revelations that reframed everything I thought I knew about my marriage, everything Lawson thought he knew about his relationship, everything Margaret thought she knew about why her husband had been blocking her access to the children. The truth was worse than any of us had imagined. Julia hadn't stumbled into a double life through loneliness or accident. She'd engineered it deliberately, methodically, over the course of years. She'd met Lawson while he was still married to Margaret, had encouraged him to delay his divorce proceedings, had positioned herself as the perfect replacement wife and mother while maintaining the financial security of her marriage to me. I never meant for it to go on this long, she said, tears streaming down her face. I thought Tom and I would drift apart naturally. I thought he'd find someone else, someone better suited for him. So you decided for me, I said, without actually ending our marriage or giving me the choice. I was protecting you. You would have been devastated if I'd just left suddenly. So instead, you left gradually, 3 nights a week for 7 years. Lawson was staring at her like he'd never seen her before. You told me Margaret was an unfit mother. You said she was violent, unpredictable, that the children were afraid of her. I was protecting the children, too, Julia protested. Margaret was in and out of rehab. She was unstable. I was fighting addiction, Margaret interrupted, and I've been clean for 18 months. But every time I tried to see my children, Lawson had another excuse. Another delay, another legal complication. Because you told me the courts had restricted her access, Lawson said to Julia. You showed me documents. Forged documents, the mediator noted, examining the papers Julia had produced earlier. These restraining orders are fabricated. Mrs. Henderson has never been legally barred from seeing her children. The web of lies was staggering in its complexity. Julia had forged legal documents to convince Lawson that Margaret was dangerous. She'd manipulated our joint finances to support his household while telling me the money was going to medical expenses and student loans. She'd created false work schedules, fake emergencies, elaborate cover stories that allowed her to maintain 2 complete lives. The phone calls, I said, remembering the anonymous tips that had started unraveling her world. You knew someone was onto you. Julia nodded miserably. It started 3 weeks ago. Someone called Lawson's office, said they had information about his unprofessional conduct. Then someone called the children's school, questioned my authority to pick them up. Then someone called my supervisor at the hospital. Someone, I repeated. She looked at me with growing understanding. It was you. It was consequences, I corrected. Something you've been avoiding for 7 years. Lawson stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. I need to understand this. You've been married to him the entire time we've been together? Legally married, yes, but emotionally. Legally is what matters, Margaret said. Legally, you're an adulteress who's been living in my house, sleeping in my bed, raising my children under false pretenses. I love those children, Julia said desperately. Whatever else you think about me, I genuinely love them. Love built on lies isn't love, I said. It's manipulation. The mediator was documenting everything, his pen moving steadily across legal forms. This conversation would become part of the custody case, evidence that would determine where the children lived and who they could see. What happens now? Lawson asked. Now everyone faces reality, I said. Julia moves out of both houses. You and Margaret work out real custody arrangements based on truth instead of lies. The children get to know their real mother without interference. And what about you? Julia asked. What do you get out of destroying everything? I looked at her, this woman I'd shared a bed with for 7 years, who'd kissed me goodbye 3 nights a week before going to live with another family. What did I want? I want you to understand that choices have consequences, that you can't just disappear from one life into another without affecting real people, that the children you claim to love deserve better than a mother figure who's been lying to them about her identity. I never lied to them about loving them. You lied to them about everything else, about who you were, about your commitment to their family, about your availability to be their mother permanently. You let them build their lives around someone who was living a fiction. Lawson was still staring out the window. 7 years, he said quietly. 7 years of thinking I'd found the perfect woman, the perfect mother for my children, the perfect partner for my life, and it was all based on lies. Not all of it, Julia protested. My feelings for you were real. My love for the children was real. But your availability was fake, Margaret said. Your commitment was fake. Your entire identity was fake. The room fell silent, except for the sound of the mediator's pen and the distant noise of the television from the living room. We were all processing the magnitude of Julia's deception, the years of careful manipulation that had brought us to this moment. I need to pack, Julia said finally. Yes, you do, I agreed, from both houses. She looked around the room one more time, as if she could find some argument that would let her keep her double life intact. But there was nothing left to say. No more lies that could bridge the gap between her two worlds. The children, she said. How do we tell them? We tell them the truth, Margaret said firmly. Age-appropriate truth, but truth. They deserve to know that their real mother loves them and has been fighting to see them. They deserve to know that you have another family, another life, another set of commitments. It will hurt them. Less than continuing to live a lie, I said. Children are resilient. They can handle truth better than adults can handle deception. Julia stood up slowly, her shoulders sagging with the weight of 7 years' worth of consequences finally catching up with her. I'll need time to find a place to live. You have until tomorrow night, I said. Pack what you need from our house, pack what belongs to you from this house, and find somewhere else to be. That's not enough time. You've had 7 years to plan for this moment. If you haven't prepared for the possibility that your lies would catch up with you, that's not our problem. Lawson turned from the window. I'll help you pack. But then I need you gone. The children need stability, and they can't have that with you here living a double life. And I need to start building a real relationship with my children, Margaret added, without interference from someone who's been manipulating the situation for years. The mediator finished his notes and closed his briefcase. I'll file my report with the court on Monday. Based on tonight's revelations, I'll be recommending immediate supervised visitation for Mrs. Henderson, with a path toward shared custody pending psychological evaluation of all parties. What about her? Lawson asked, nodding toward Julia. She has no legal standing in this case. She's not the children's mother, stepmother, or legal guardian. Her relationship with them was based on deception, which invalidates any claims she might have made. Julia's face crumpled. In one evening, she'd lost both of her families, both of her lives, both of her carefully constructed identities. She was about to become a 36-year-old woman with no home, no husband, no children, and a reputation for elaborate deception that would follow her wherever she went. It was exactly what she deserved. I should go, she said quietly. Yes, I agreed. You should. She walked toward the door, then paused. Tom, I know you hate me right now, but I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you. You meant to deceive me, I said. For 7 years. The hurt was inevitable. She nodded and left the room. A few minutes later, I heard her car starting in the driveway, heard the sound of her taillights disappearing down the suburban street one last time. Margaret was already kneeling in the living room, talking quietly to her children, beginning the long process of rebuilding their relationship. Lawson was staring at the evidence spread across his coffee table, trying to understand how completely he'd been fooled. The mediator packed up his materials and left, promising to file his report first thing Monday morning. And I stood in the doorway, watching the wreckage of Julia's carefully constructed double life, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but wasn't regret either. Justice, maybe. Or just the natural consequence of 7 years' worth of lies finally colliding with reality. Julia's night shift was finally over, and this time she wouldn't be coming home. The house felt different when I returned that evening, empty in a way it had never been before, even during Julia's night shifts. This wasn't temporary absence. This was permanent change, the end of a chapter that had been written in lies and deception. I poured myself a drink and sat in my workshop, surrounded by the tools of my trade. Hammers and saws, levels and measuring tapes, instruments of precision and accuracy. Everything in its place, everything serving its intended purpose, unlike my marriage, which had been built on false foundations and crooked measurements. My phone buzzed with a text message from Eddie. How did it go? I typed back, It's over, all of it. Good. You deserve better. I did deserve better. I deserved a partner who was actually present, actually committed, actually honest about who she was and what she wanted. Julia had given me none of those things, but she'd given me something else, the knowledge that I was strong enough to face the truth, no matter how painful. The divorce would be finalized within weeks now. No more delays, no more complications, no more elaborate deceptions, just the simple legal dissolution of a marriage that had been over for 7 years. I finished my drink and went to bed in a house that was finally completely mine. Outside, Mrs. Dower's porch light was on, a beacon of normalcy in a neighborhood that had just witnessed the spectacular collapse of one family's elaborate lies. Tomorrow, she'd probably knock on my door with coffee and questions, wanting to know what all the commotion had been about. I'd tell her the truth, all of it, because that's what people deserved. Truth, not carefully crafted deceptions designed to make life more convenient for the deceiver. Julia would have to find somewhere else to live her lies, somewhere else to build her elaborate double lives, somewhere else to manipulate people who cared about her. But she'd never do it to me again. The night shift was over, and morning was coming.